Dear listeners, welcome back to the History on Drugs podcast. I'm Isaac Campos, your host. This is a podcast about drugs and history and being a historian or being another kind of scholar. We'll interview people who aren't historians too. And really just about life in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We've had a couple of great episodes so far. This is going to be episode number 3. It is connected, the whole podcast that is, to the newsletter of the same name called History on Drugs, which you can find a link to in the description. And the newsletter, like this podcast, and really like drugs, I think, is sometimes serious, sometimes funny, sometimes both at the same time, but never really catering to, I suppose, the outrage economy, rather trying to cultivate the better angels of our nature. Some famous guy said that at some point. In any case, this is episode number 3. Today I interview Nancy Campbell. Nancy is a professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic University in Troy, New York, which is the nation's oldest technological research university. She's got a PhD in the history of consciousness, interestingly, from UC Santa Cruz. And she's written a bunch of books about drugs. Her most recent is called OD, Naloxone and the Politics of Overdose, which was published by MIT Press in 2020. And she's got a bunch of others. There's Women, Gender, Drug Policy, and Social Justice, Gendering Addiction, the Politics of Drug Treatment in a Neurochemical World, The Narcotic Farm, the Rise and Fall of America's First Prison for Drug Addicts, Discovering Addiction, the Science and Politics of Substance Abuse Research, plus plenty of articles. She's one of the editors of the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs, which is the flagship journal for drug historians. And on top of all that, she's got this fascinating backstory of growing up in rural Pennsylvania in the shadow of a nuclear plant, driving across the country with a weird idea to make a career in letterpress printing, and somehow that leading her into a career as an academic and a drug historian. So it's a pretty good story, and I think you'll find it quite fascinating. Now, we don't always talk a lot of drugs on this podcast. In our last episode, we talked more about academia and teaching and learning than drugs. But this one, we're going to talk a lot of drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. But you'll also get another story about growing up in the second half of the 20th century in the United States of America, and it's another good one. I was going to put this out last weekend, but the end of the semester got the best of me. I was really busy with grading and all that stuff. I also got some chronic insomnia in the process, and that's been a major drag. The good news is it's been fodder for a post over at the newsletter on caffeine, on dependence, on addiction, on Buddhism, and various other things, which is the kind of thing I like to write over there. All right, well, before we get down to business, I just want to remind you to rate, review, subscribe, all that stuff to the podcast. It really helps get the word out, and that way I can get the voices of my great guests out there to more people, which would be really terrific. It really helps. For years, I never subscribed or rated or reviewed anything, and then I started doing this and realized, wow, it really helps, and then, boy, that doesn't take very long to do. So anyway, if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. My guests would really appreciate it. So thanks in advance for that. All right, enough of my yapping. Here's my conversation with Nancy Campbell. So you had talked about the kind of teaching you do and bringing in drug stuff to there and so forth. But I want to go back a little bit. Where did you grow up? What part of the country did you grow up in and so forth?
Yeah, so my extended family has been in a couple of counties in northeastern central Pennsylvania. For many generations, we were, settler colonialists. So I come from a very small town called Berwick, which is on the Susquehanna River, the north branch of the Susquehanna River. And for a large part of my young life, my first 13 years, I actually lived elsewhere in Pennsylvania, but I have a huge extended family still in Berwick and its near environs. My mother was from a village up the river called Beach Haven, which has now disappeared under the shadow of a nuclear plant, which opened when I was in high school. Now, I graduated from high school in 1981. It was a couple years after the 3 Mile Island accident, which was 60 miles down the river from us. We still opened that plant. It was under construction. There was briefly a moratorium on new plant construction, but it was actually called the Susquehanna Steam Electric Plant. In its early days, it wasn't called the nuclear plant, but it's still there and it's still going, and they're bringing in cryptocurrency mining facilities right up against the shadow of the nuclear plant. And so that little village that my mother and her brother grew up in, and that I visited my grandparents in many, many times, has largely disappeared. There's no more postal code. It's kind of evaporated from the map. It's really just the nuclear plant now. The importance of origin stories, I think, in terms of historians, I have very early memories of my grandfather's drug room. My grandfather's office was attached to their house. So my grandparents' house was a big brick house, and then there was this office attached to it. And we were allowed as children, I was the oldest, I could go over and play in the waiting room. I could play, even interact with patients and certainly interact with staff. On weekends, we went over and we measured pills into little paper envelopes. And the room itself was like a little hallway, but it went floor to ceiling. And there were these colored jars up on the top that probably hadn't been used in a very long time. My grandfather went to medical school. He had this kind of history that you could tell the whole story of doctoring in this country if you looked at the differences between my father's career and my grandfather's career. And that when they went into practice together, I was old enough to, I really watched my father go through medical school. And they were allowed to bring boxes of bones, metal boxes of bones, to learn anatomy. They were under the bed. And I remember, I remember playing with these things. I think about these early moments, encounters, childhood encounters with medicine, with patients, with people, with these things. And I just think, was that a fantasy? That would never happen today.
Were you always a good student? I mean, you have all these connections to medicine and the history of these things. Were you a good student from the beginning? Did you have ambitions to be a doctor too, or anything like that?
No, I was actually trying to avoid the family. I think my grandmother in particular would have loved it if I'd gone to medical school, but I let my little sister do that instead. I was a newspaper editor in both high school and in college. So that was my life, that and running cross country. I was, for a brief time, the only girl on the cross country team. I ran on the boys cross country team because there simply weren't enough women at that time. So I was a runner, and I thought of myself as a writer. I was the editor of the literary magazine and the newspaper, and part of what was interesting about that was that at the time, we had a printing press in the newspaper office. We had a darkroom. I did a lot of work with offset, preparing photographs for offset printing. We used to make headlines on little pieces of balsa wood, where the letters had been photographically affixed to the balsa wood, and we could slide them around on wax templates to make a headline. And so I loved that stuff. I loved the hands-on quality of it. And when I went to college, I found out that there was this even older way of printing. And I did spend years setting metal type and doing letterpress printing for the Press of Apple Tree Alley in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. And then that actually comes back into my story when I'm in California, because letterpress printing was an art form. It's an art form. But it was once the way we printed anything, right? Whether it was art or not. And so to me, it was a very powerful pull to kind of own the means of production and know how to produce print matter, print material from the bottom up. And so I learned all kinds of production skills from that. I guess we would call them project management today, but it was really about learning how to put something out, right? How to put something out to the public, how to make sure that it was copy edited and that it was, I don't regret 1 minute investing in these sort of archaic technologies that are of no use to me whatsoever today, because I feel like that's where I got my sensibility about my historical sensibility about how things go together and the ways in which what you are producing is having an effect on your reader. And I realized that was very central to my high school and college life was, every week we put out that newspaper. And so it was exhausting and it was difficult to fit in, but that was the priority. I mean, that in a sense was, and then when I went to college, I also became a peer writing tutor in a writing center, a kind of a cross-curricular writing center that my college roommate still runs to this day at Bucknell. We were members of the inaugural peer writing tutor class, and that was another sort of moment that I think really helped me understand this is a teachable skill. It's something I understand. It's something I can do. It's something I still do with my students, both graduate and undergraduate. It's a transferable skill. I can even catch most of the Chat GPT written essays now because I have that skill.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's a headache. Let's not even talk about that for a second. Wait, so did you start that writing center? Was that like your initiative, or is it something you were just in the inaugural group?
No, actually, there was an amazing faculty member at Bucknell, Catherine Smith, who started that. That was a movement all across the country. And I had no idea that when I signed up for, I think it was a Jan plan, it was called. I had no idea really what it was. I just thought it would be helpful for the newspaper, which again was my college experience in a lot of ways.
Okay, so wait a second. You sound like somebody who always had a lot of will to do what it was you wanted. I mean, when you said that you were the only girl on this high school cross-country team, what was that like? I mean, what was your attitude about that? That sounds like that would be incredibly intimidating. I can imagine that might be the thing that would make most people say, oh, forget it then. I don't want to deal with all these guys on this thing.
And that's kind of a theme in my life. I tend to be quickly unsettled by the normal and to seek things that are a little bit less common for people like me to seek. I did become very interested in the various drug cultures that were springing up around me during that time. And although I didn't think that I didn't have an intention to go become a drug policy historian, I did have feelings about, isn't it interesting that you couldn't be anti-Semitic, you couldn't be racist, you couldn't be outright homophobic and sexist, but you could say anything derogatory about drug users, those druggies. Yeah. And that was something that I understood, that kind of stigma, and also my kind of odd affinity for or alliance with people who were stigmatized through that route. For some reason, it was just never a surprise to me that people who used legal drugs were not spoken of in such terms, and people who used illicit drugs were. And that line was very, very clear in my young life because I saw my father and grandfather prescribing. I would have to be in the summers processing insurance forms, coming up with diagnostic codes, interpreting my father and grandfather's terrible handwriting on patient records. There was no HIPAA in that era. And so it was fine to have a high school kid in the back end of the office doing all of this. But of course, people would go out for lunch or something along those lines, and I would be left to be the receptionist at times. And so that was a fascinating interaction with patients. And so that kind of understanding of what's a patient, how do patients present, what is the character of the ill person, what is the character of the person who's not ill but drug seeking, those kinds of things were very apparent. Like, you really didn't have to be an ethnographer to understand what was happening in the social situation of the doctor's office in that era.
Okay. Now, you said a few minutes ago that you always tend to be drawn to things that are odd for someone like you. What do you mean by someone like me? Do you mean as a woman, or do you mean you're kind of going against what maybe others in your family would have done, or, I don't know, is there some religious aspect or what?
Yeah. So my family, we're clearly white. This is a very white area of the country. It's a very Christian area of the country. At the time when I was growing up, we were Lutherans sometimes and Methodists others. It just depended where we lived and which church we were close to. My grandparents were more religious, and my aunts and uncles and so forth. So there was a kind of Protestantism, sort of general Protestantism, that I also had a bit of rebellion against. And there was also a kind of assumptions were definitely made around what I learned to call in college compulsory heterosexuality. And so I felt like much of my life was a kind of exploration of, well, wait a second, it's possible to live a life that is a good life without subscribing to the tenets of each of these ways of being. And so regardless of the choices that I make in my life, and I early on understood that it's not all about individual choice. Like, this is not a Horatio Alger kind of story. It's more a story of realization of the incredible diversity of the world, despite being very grounded in this place and in these cultures, which of course have really entrenched themselves since. I do not think I was raised to be the way I see people being in that place at this time. This is a place 30 miles down the river from where Joe Biden was born. And on my great-grandparents' home, which is no longer in our family, there are huge "fuck Biden" and "let's go Brandon" signs. It's that kind of country. And so I really regret the loss of the kind of home that I feel that I had and the kind of growing up that I had, because certainly my family was not that way. All of my siblings, grew up to become very different from what has happened in that place. I read Deaths of Despair, the Economist's take on what's happening. Mm-hmm. This is exactly that kind of place, right? This is a place where a lot of people died of COVID because they just refused to mask or get vaccinated. This is a place where white people's longevity is falling due to alcoholism, suicide, overdose. I am interested in those as a historian, in part because I see what transformation has occurred in this place over my lifetime.
Yeah. So let me ask you about that. When did you said that you noticed the way that drug addicts were treated differently. I had a kind of similar thing. It wasn't so much about how drug addicts were treated, but it was definitely about the hypocrisy of all these things. And that was in the fifth grade. My dad recommended for a book report that I do something on the opium wars. And, I had sort of the, encyclopedia version of what that was in the mid 80s, which was, the British had forced opium on the Chinese. And right in the heart of the war on drugs, for me, it was so interesting that it was like so hypocritical, this whole thing. I think that draws a lot of us probably, or the hypocrisies and the paradoxes in this stuff. But when would you say you first started noticing how drug addicts were treated? And then the second part of that is, when did you start getting interested in actually studying this stuff, studying drugs?
Yeah, so I think I noticed those things very, very early. I remember a particular event at my grandparents' where someone referred to, this was also true, by the way, of people who were mentally ill in any way. This is a very small town. Everyone knows everybody, and everybody knows the entire genealogy of everyone else. And so this kind of intolerance was something that I felt, that kind of hypocrisy was something I felt even as, I would say, fifth grade, sixth grade, when you're beginning to notice things about the world that cut against the grain of how you're being raised. Now, I did not set out to be a drug historian or think about drug policy until I was an adult, until I was living. I was actually living in California, and I'll tell you that story because it is a story of the clash of absolutes in a lot of ways, right? And so it plays into all of the nascent affective realizations from when you're a child, and you begin to realize that the world is, and in particular, I remember saying to my mother, I know that you want me to be normal, but I'm not that interested in being normal. Normalcy was something that I was interested in resisting. And I knew, by the way, that I couldn't do it there because I did not, really want to embarrass or be an anathema or a pariah in this place that I felt was home. And so I thought, I need to get pretty far away if I'm going to become who I am, become myself. And at that point, I didn't really define myself. I really defined myself as someone who was interested in letterpress printing and in that kind of production mode. I did some freelance work. I, in short, ran away with my first husband, who I did eventually marry, my college boyfriend, and we went to Seattle. We drove across the country. We took 6 months. We camped, and we visited letterpress printers to see if we could apprentice to them. Most of them were not running a large enough operation to consider apprentices. And so we ended up staying in Seattle, where there was at the time a whole community of letterpress printers, and we could sort of get involved on the edges of that. We purchased our own press. We scrounged around for letterpress. I worked in print shops. I did darkroom work. I did typesetting. I did all of this kind of stuff because in those days, in the 80s in Seattle, our rent was $300 a month. I did end up going and getting a master's degree in English literature, mainly rhetoric and composition at the University of Washington, because the outfit I was working for at the time went under. And so I went to grad school and I did that thing. And a lot of those folks ended up becoming technical writers for this outfit in the East Bay, East Seattle, which became Microsoft. And I didn't. I had this sort of anti-corporate edge, and I didn't really be wanting to work for people. I wanted to kind of somehow do my own thing. And I do not know why. I just did not think that I wanted to be an academic at that time. Mm-hmm. My experience at a large state university, University of Washington, I had a wonderful advisor, Susan Jeffords, who wrote about the remasculinization of America. I understood then what gender theory was. I read Foucault. I worked, and actually the most meaningful experience from my master's degree, I wrote a thesis about, it was called The Political Representation of Pain. And one of the most important experiences was to have other English professors say to me, you want to use these techniques to read public policy? That's not really what we do here. You have to find somewhere else where they do that. And I was briefly a research assistant for a professor, rhetorician, George Dillon. And he was studying interdisciplinary knowledge formations and what the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity was in these different places. So these were things like economists who were studying the rhetoric of economics. But there was also a chapter that I did all of the research for, which was about these people who were studying science as if it was culture. And science studies was really just becoming a thing at that time. And so he had me looking at citation indexes and following who cited the work of Bruno Latour. And one of the people who did was this woman, Donna Haraway. And I read her work. And I read in particular her essay, her 1988 essay, Situated Knowledges. And I was like, that if I ever do decide that I want to be an academic, that's the kind of work that I want to do. That was very meaningful for me, thinking that you could think in a meta-cognitive kind of way about science, about the way in which knowledge comes from the place, that place matters to the kind of science that gets done. But the fact was I was really alienated.
So is this, sorry, but I don't know that essay. Is that like, is this like kind of the cultural construction of knowledge, basically, that sort of thing? Like all knowledge is created within a set of subjectivities or what have you that are culturally bound or something like that? Is that what?
Exactly. At the time, There was a big conversation in feminist theory, and one of the important people who was at UW was Nancy Hartsock, a political theorist, who wrote a book called Money, Sex, and Power. And she was hooked up with a number of people like Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, and other people who were really looking at the way in which how we know ourselves, how we know our bodies, how we know ourselves, that was all bound up with power and with institutional hierarchies. And so situated knowledges was precisely as you just said, all knowledge is situated knowledge. And any knowledge that claims not to be situated, the so-called God trick, as Donna named it, is we should begin to investigate what exactly are the groundings and situations of that kind of knowledge. But be that as it may, when I finished my master's degree at University of Washington, I thought I was done with academia. I thought this is really interesting, but I just don't think that it's who I am. And so
what year was that?
So that was the late 80s. I think I finished in 87.
Okay.
And then my husband and I at the time, we did find a letterpress printer that was big enough to be able to afford to give us an apprenticeship. And so we moved to Northern California to this place that I'll tell you about in a minute. But we were in Seattle maybe 3 years after college, and it was a great time to be in Seattle. There was a lot going on. There was an intense music scene. It was a place where you could hear music every night, Celtic music, the sort of Nirvana. There was this whole kind of grunge, Riot Girls kind of thing happening in that area. Not all just in Seattle. It was hard. So it was hard to leave, but it was also finally, right, we'd found a place, we thought, where we could go, we could apprentice ourselves to this craft, and we could begin to learn in a more systematic way the letterpress printing process.
Okay, so you decide to go to where in Northern California did you go to?
Yeah, so this is the interesting part, and this is where I become a drug policy historian. So we moved to a place called Covelo, which is in the Round Valley, which is in the Coast Range in Mendocino County.
Okay.
Covelo was a very small town, and it had been the scene of a back to the land movement, but we were many years too late for that movement. We were much younger, and by then, the back to the land scene had largely shifted, but Covelo was interesting because it is also the site of the second largest Native American reservation in the state of California. And it's a checkerboard. kind of place where you never know, are you on public lands or are you on private lands? It's a ranching community, white ranchers, cattle ranching, often running cattle on public lands because it's where the North Fork of the Eel River comes into a valley, a very large round valley, and it borders the Yolla Bolly Wilderness, which is a very large wilderness area, maybe among the largest in the continental U.S. And a couple of people who were also a little too old for the Back to the Land movement, Jim and Carolyn Robertson, moved there from San Francisco, where they had been part of a sort of hippie design scene. But Jim, again, they were older, and they started this press called the Yolla Bolly Press. And it was a letterpress printing, it was not a company, it was an imprint in a very large redwood barn among, the manzanita and the madrone trees. I still remember being in that place and just going outside. It's so dry at certain times of the year that you hear the bark dropping off the madrone trees like rain.
Wow.
And it's that kind of place. So apprenticing was something that letterpress printers did. In the old days, there was a lot of this sort of itinerant journeyman letterpress printing, people sharing their knowledge and moving around. And it was kind of a trade, right? It wasn't for, people who were becoming professors. It was a trade. Mm-hmm. You worked with your hands most of the time. But Jim and Carolyn had another side to their business, and that was the side that was about packaging books for Sierra Club. And what that meant was editing large format coffee table books, putting writers and artists and photographers together, bringing in woodcut artists to do limited editions. Their books, their letterpress books, they published a lot of Californiana, and they sold for $1,000 a pop. And so they had this artist books business, and then they had this packaging coffee table photography books. And so I turned out to be useful. That old experience that I had editing newspapers turned out to be very useful for project management on the coffee table books. Now, this is an era, we're now talking about the late 80s, the last 2 years of the 80s, because I ended up writing a proposal to go to graduate school while I was there. And the reason for that was I decided that I couldn't live with the contradictions of the war on drugs. They were going on around me. It was a very interesting time because, of course, there was a lot of what we would call today trespass grows on public lands in that area. There were large-scale marijuana growing concerns, but there was an awful lot, much more, sort of mom and pop people growing it for personal use and to sell a little to get by, because the people who were left from the Back to the Land movement were people who were not rich and did not have a way back into the white middle class. And so they were still there, and they were carpenters and woodwrights. I learned woodworking from them. They grew, they made their living, they were getting by, right? Making their living in whatever ways you can make your living. Now, at the same time, right, it's a Native American reservation to which something like 12 different tribes were relocated in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. So many of the Native Americans were not local from that place, but were relocated there. And since I lived there, there are now historians writing about this place, including Caitlin Reed, who is I don't know whether you have read this book, Settler Cannabis. But Caitlin Reed is a Yurok Hupa Oneida, and she is an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Humboldt State. And she wrote this book, Settler Cannabis, that I've just read, From Gold Rush to Green Rush in Indigenous Northern California, essentially about this place that I found myself sort of washed up on the shores of in the late 1980s. Now, she doesn't specifically mention Covelo, but she does mention the way in which the Back to the Land movement itself appropriated land, right? So it wasn't just the white ranchers who appropriated land, but also she asks the question, back to whose land was the Back to the Land movement? That said, at the time, there were still really interesting remnants of the Back to the Land movement, including people who grew marijuana plants out in the hills and who, created their own water irrigation systems. So there were those kinds of folks. But then there were also there was a much greater, almost paramilitary practice of growing on public lands in order to avoid asset forfeiture. And so when I got there, it was odd because it's very remote. It's an hour from another grocery store. It's an hour from Willits. You have to drive a very far way up into the hills to reach this town. But there were helicopters in the air all the time because there was this, it was called the Campaign Against Marijuana Planting Camp. So there was no network television, or there was very rarely network television in Covelo. The one time of the year when it was important for people to have network television was the Super Bowl. And so before the Super Bowl, like these, guys would hike up to the top of the mountain and adjust the antennas so that we could get, for a few months until they sort of, went back to where they really were, network coverage. And we had a television because we had moved from Seattle that we could never use. And then one day at the bar, we hear, yeah, you can get network television. We can watch the Super Bowl. So fine and good. We decide to tune in. And it just happened to be that moment when all of the news shows like Dateline, NBC, and all of those news shows were broadcasting programs about the war on drugs. Except those programs were not what I was observing. They were all about crack cocaine, and they were mostly about pregnant African-American women using crack cocaine. And so to me, all right, now the level of hypocrisy and contradiction are just exceeding what, I could take. I began to wonder, what is the war on drugs? If it's both of these things, and if the implications, right, the social, cultural, political implications of these things are held together somehow by this incoherent container, the war on drugs. And shouldn't I be studying that, right? That it seemed at the time very compelling. I had no idea there was a there. I had no idea anybody had ever written about any of this stuff. It just kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah,
it came out of the atmosphere. It came to me that this is what I wanted to do.
And this bizarre thing in this weird place that people want to watch the Super Bowl, which is maybe the most surprising part of the whole story you've told so far. That we've got to go up to the top of the mountain so we get the Super Bowl on. I wonder how many. I don't really wonder. I mean, it's obvious that so many of us who got interested in studying this were all turned on to this area of study by the excesses of the 1980s war on drugs. I mean, there were just so many contradictions, so many obvious hypocrisies that it just made it really interesting, and inspired people.
Yeah. So it inspired me to sit on my tiny green screen of my compact computer, which was like the size of a sewing machine. It was a massive thing, and it had this tiny green screen. And I wrote a proposal to History of Consciousness at the University of California at Santa Cruz.
History of Consciousness. So this is going back to what you were inspired by as a master's student, then presumably, right? This idea that what are the structures, or what are the subjectivities that have created these ideas about the war on drugs, basically, right? And so
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, Bruno Latour's not laboratory life, but science in action really inspired me to think about the different kinds of scientific communities, including social work and psychiatric social work and the various ways in which scientists try to influence public policy, particularly in the drugs arena. But at first, I just got into grad school.
Yeah.
And so I moved to Santa Cruz, and I learned that Santa Cruz history of consciousness was much different than my master's degree at the University of Washington. HisCon was all-encompassing. We read critical race theory. These were the early days of critical legal studies and critical race theory, feminist jurisprudence. I was very interested in law and policy because I thought I was writing about the war on drugs. And so I very quickly became absorbed in this world that really taught me to ask different kinds of questions and really, in a lot of ways, took everything that I'd brought with me to that point and kind of pulled it apart and helped me to examine the kinds of assumptions that are made about drugs, about drug users, about drug markets, about the politics of drugs. And it was a really fruitful, really interesting time to be at History of Consciousness. Donna Haraway was there. Wendy Brown, feminist theorist Wendy Brown, was there at the time. She was on my committee. Barbara Epstein, the historian of temperance and leftist social movements. And social movement theory was really important to me at the time. Some HisCon folks had written a book called Racial Formation in the United States. And we also hired Angela Davis while I was a graduate student. She was on my committee as well. And so it was just a ferment of collision in so many fruitful ways, of very different ways of thinking that I could somehow learn to bring to bear on drugs. The important moments in graduate school were often with other graduate students in conversations, but also I do think that my advisor, Donna Haraway, taught me to ask different kinds of questions, taught me to read in a really different way than I had been taught to read and write. And she always, to her credit, reminded her grad students that they shouldn't write like her because she has a very complex syntax. And she's always trying to entertain a lot of ideas all at once. And I had a lot of affinity for that, but it was not something that I could do that early in my career. I'm not I'm still apprenticed, I think, to that way of reading and writing. So I ended up writing a dissertation that was not about the contradictions that had gotten me into thinking about the war on drugs, but about the 1950s, about the U.S. drug policy in the 1950s and the various kinds of communities, expert communities, who had input into that, including, wherever I could, the voices of drug users themselves. They were often testifying in congressional hearings and being asked questions about the experience of using drugs. The Daniel hearings, you'll probably recall, were in 7 U.S. cities, and they were televised. And women in the Daniel hearings were especially asked very probing questions about the experience of using drugs. And so I was very interested in that. And that is how I ended up getting hired in women's studies at Ohio State, which was my first academic job. So I don't think that I would have said that I was yet a historian of science, technology, medicine, or drugs until David Musto. He convened a group of us who had all filed dissertations on drugs in different disciplines in the mid-90s. So I think that he gathered us maybe in 1997 or 98, and he brought a bunch of us. I met a lot of the people who would be my peers in the drug policy history world at that gathering, and it was only in that moment was I co-constituted. Oh, yes, I guess I am. I have become a drug historian, drug policy historian. That is a name for what I do. Because quite honestly, before that, you read David Courtwright and David Musto, and that was kind of it.
That was it, yeah. Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. So wait, when were the Daniel hearings?
So the Daniel hearings were back in 56, 57.
Okay.
Senator
I didn't realize
Price Daniel.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, Senator Price Daniel, Republican in Texas, wanted to run for president. And this was a route toward that. He didn't end up making good on that ambition, but he did manage to circulate a set of ideas about drugs that had actually been circulated with the Kefauver hearings, leading to the Boggs Act in 1951. Right. And so those ideas about juvenile delinquency, and as we've previously discussed, I've always had a soft spot in my heart for juvenile delinquents. that era, the 1950s, was an era of criminalization. And the Daniel hearings, the people I started to follow, who were these addiction researchers, these scientists, they testified in the New York, the Daniel hearings that were held in New York, which were the second of the hearings. They brought all of these researchers from Lexington, Kentucky, up to New York to testify in these hearings. And I did wonder what was in the water in Lexington that all of these guys sounded like drug policy reformers in my era, in the 1990s. They all sounded like, we should not be criminalizing, even though they were working at the narcotic farm in Lexington, Kentucky, they sounded liberal. And they were politically liberal, and they opposed criminalization. They didn't prevail, but I got very curious in what were the various ideas that were contending for the politics of what became the war on drugs? Because I would say the war on drugs did start pretty much in the 50s. I was also really interested in the contention between doctors, physicians, and lawyers, and the sort of drug warrior law enforcement types in the 50s, because they were really duking it out. Is it going to be considered a crime, or is it going to be considered a disease? And those were the two choices. Sure. And so I was interested in how those choices got cemented. That was the purpose of what I was trying to do in the dissertation, which I never published. And thankfully so. I've published several chapters of it because it was really a lot of ideas knocking around. And it was I hadn't found the intellectual community, the field that you and I inhabit today wasn't really formed up. And so I felt like a lone voice.
For sure.
Nobody else in HISCON was interested in what I was interested in. I felt like I was sort of off in the wilderness. And really, honestly, it wasn't till David Musto convened. I think it was me, Joe Spillane, Carolyn Acker. There were quite a few other people, but the people who sort of stayed in the field, that was a really important moment of identity formation for me, because I thought, okay, that's what I am.
Yeah.
Now I've got a label.
Yeah. Well, so for the listeners, the Lexington narcotics farm is essentially a prison, a federal prison. Opened what, in 29 or 31?
No, 35.
35. Okay. And this is where the drug addicts would be sent. And so basically what you're describing is the people who have the most experience with actual drug addicts, and with our current being the 1950s policies saying, this isn't working, obviously, right? And then the 50s, I agree with, I usually date the war on drugs to earlier, but the 50s is crucial. The first mandatory minimums, a lot of people don't realize that. Everybody associates mandatory minimums with the 80s. We actually see them in the 50s. So we see all that there. But then this is precisely what I wanted to ask you about, is what it was like being kind of alone. I was talking to James Bradford about this when I interviewed him. I recently went back and was reading Musto, The American Disease, for the first time in years. It's probably the first drug history book I read, first or second. When I read it, I didn't know anything. I've gone back and mined it for stuff, but I'd never gone back and really read it. And I started doing that this summer just because I actually went back to mine it for a few things. And then I started reading. I was like, I haven't read this in a long time. And I was blown away by what a great book that is.
Yeah.
I think after I had, I went to grad school and all this stuff. I started, Musto only had a master's in history. So, in history of medicine, as he was a physician. It's often written by physicians rather than PhDs in history, sometimes both. And I was just blown away. I was like, man, this is still a great, great book. I mean, he was obviously just the absolute pathbreaker in the field, certainly in U.S. drug history. And that book still holds up in so many ways. I mean, there are little things, I don't love the marijuana stuff, but, there wasn't a lot on that at the time. But then, one of my favorite things is just what great scholarship it is. You follow a footnote, and you get into the footnote, and there's, 12 citations there, and there's exactly what you were wondering about in the main text. The answer's right there in the footnote. Like every single detail is covered. I mean, what was he like? I never met him.
Yeah. So what David Musto was like, so my father's name is also David, and David Musto just reminded me of my father. It was very, very strange because I completely agree with you. Now, I read that book. I read two books. I read David Musto's American Disease and Ed Brecker's Licit and Illicit Drugs in the public library of Mendocino County. I drove down to Ukiah to read these books, partly because it was air conditioned, and there was no air conditioning anywhere in Covelo. So I would, that would be my research trip. I would, drive an hour. I would read hour and a half, really, read these books, and then, drive back. And that book was so thorough, and it really gave you a story. You had a whole unfolding story. He was also very clear on the racialization of the war on drugs and the various points at which it could have been different, but it wasn't. And so you don't get an even story. You get an uneven, differential, really well-grounded account of how drug law came to be and how it came to be used. And so reading that, though, the one place where the reason I wrote my dissertation about the 50s was I felt like he gave short shrift to the 50s. And he actually said to me when, he gathered us all in New Haven, I think really there were 12 of us. NIDA had given him some money to bring together the next generation of drug policy historians. And he
what
brought
year was
the
this?
older.
What year?
It was in the 90s. He brought the older generation. He brought John Burnham, who was my colleague at Ohio State, who wrote a book called Bad Habits, and who thought that temperance, but prohibition worked. And he brought David Courtwright, who of course was a convivial presence as always. And he brought Ruth Eng from Indiana, who had been kind of harassed, a colleague, similarly to the way that Alfred Lindesmith had been harassed. Ruth Eng was more an alcohol person. And
harassed by like the
BNDD, the DEA, right? Yeah. All of the harassers. And and then 12 of us who had just finished dissertations. All kinds of quality. There was somebody who did, I think, rhetoric on drugs. There were just lots of us who had never met, never knew there was a field. And so David Musto just seemed very avuncular, and he just wanted to see what was out there and the ways in which people were writing into the work that, in part, really, he and David Courtwright had really set up, I think, the parameters of the field. And I remember him saying to me that he had sort of skipped over the 50s, yes, because he didn't think it was that important because nothing changed. And it was important to me because it was the criminalization, the further criminalization, right? So the Daniel hearings, they could have decided, to repeal or damp down on those mandatory minimums that had been set in 1951. And instead, they upped the ante. They included the death penalty for traffickers. There was a lot of talk around the U.S.-Mexico border because some of the hearings were held in Texas. And so I felt like the 50s were an important kind of precursor. And I still remember thinking, oh no, David, he doesn't think that anything really happened in this era that I thought was important. So I'm glad I wrote the way that I did. I'm glad I was kind of free of any kind of established history. The other interesting thing that Musto did was shortly after that, 1898 was the anniversary of heroin. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the gathering that I'm talking about was 96. And then in 1998, he also convened, with the help of NIDA, a conference in New Haven called 100 Years of Heroin. And what was so interestingly wonderful about that conference was it was held at the same time and in the same hotel as a sales conference for Bayer.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say for OxyContin.
No, we weren't there yet.
I'm getting there, but it's also, of course, 1898 is the Spanish-American War, which brings the Philippines into U.S. possession, which is, an absolutely fundamental event in the birth of American drug policy. So David Musto, everybody's a David in the field, too. That always cracks me up. These foundational, but David Musto, David Courtwright, your father.
And now David Hertzberg.
And David Hertzberg, And I wanted to know the date, so 1996, it sounds like that conference was, because I hadn't heard of this. I didn't realize you'd had this conference. This reminds me, there's a famous conference in 1989 among all the biggest drug traffickers in Mexico, where they sort of try to sort out what. But this really is like a foundational moment for our field.
Yes.
I was getting interested in it right around that time, a little bit later. So 97 or 98 was when I first got the idea of studying drugs. I was just thinking about graduate school, and that's how I learned about David Musto. I didn't know anything about anything, and I went and read his stuff and David Courtwright and William Walker III, because he wrote about Latin America. And that's where I first began to learn about stuff. And in fact, I asked David Courtwright if I could talk to him, and we talked on the phone. I remember sitting in my little apartment in Ann Arbor, and he was so, as he always is, incredibly gracious and supportive, and it seemed amazing that this.
Yeah.
So wait, so you're at Ohio State, right up the road here from me. How long were you there?
Yeah, so I was there 4 years, 5 years. In my 5th year, I was pregnant with my son, and I got the opportunity to make a move to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in science studies. And it was really hard to leave the Columbus. There's an incredible scene there, an incredible sort of feminist, lesbian, trans scene in Columbus. And it was hard to make the decision to move into STS, into science and technology studies. But there was a book that by then I knew that I wanted to write. And it did not have to do with gender or women. The book that I wrote that came out in 2000 came out very shortly after I had made the transition to RPI. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about the science, the addiction, so-called addiction research, the science of substance abuse, and in particular, the laboratory-based science, which no one had really written about, which was partly because the laboratory that was dedicated to this topical area was, as you mentioned earlier, located within a very large hybrid prison hospital that treated both people who were sent there, mandated there, who were felons in that they had violated U.S. drug laws and they were in prison, and voluntary treatment seekers, oftentimes, by the way, healthcare professionals who got into trouble with drugs. Yeah. And because they had access and because they had knowledge. And so this small laboratory, which started when the U.S. Public Health Service and the Federal Bureau of Prisons teamed up to create the U.S. narcotic farm, that came with congressional authorization in early 1929, the building of the narcotic farms. There were 2 of them, one in Fort Worth, Texas, and the other in Lexington, Kentucky. Only Lexington had the scientific research facilities, and Congress mandated that there be a laboratory dedicated to the cure of drug addiction, narcotics addiction, as they called it in those days. And as a historian, I always use the terms that the people that I'm studying used. And so that was called after 1948. So between 1935 and 1948, it was just the lab. In 1948, it became part of the National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH, and it was renamed the Addiction Research Center. And it existed in that form, although they embellished, they bought more equipment, they created a larger research ward. In the early days, they only studied about 6 people at a time because that was all they had room for. And they produced most of the clinical research, most of the human research. They also did some animal models, animal research as well. But really, until the 1960s, they were the world's, dedicated laboratory for this purpose. And I became very interested in them when I was reading those early books, Ed Brecker's book and David Musto's book. I realized that there was a there, and I looked up, the publications of the scientists who worked there, and I realized that there was a very large story. Now, at first, I thought it was another Tuskegee syphilis study. Right. I thought it was a massive human experimentation kind of place. But historians have to be prepared to change our minds. And so as I got into it and amassed documents and was able to speak with people who had been there, who had worked there, because it still exists. It's now the intramural research program of NIDA. It moved from Lexington, Kentucky to Baltimore, Maryland, and Rockville, Maryland in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And so it's a continuous line, discontinuous in place. So I knew that I wanted to write that book. That had become very clear to me that no one else had really thought about this place and the science and what the scientists were trying to do with their science, the politics of the situation, right? So that book, that was published in 2007, but I would say that I was writing it really from 2000 on. I had to get funding, which thank goodness the NSF Science and Society program provided to myself and Joe Spillane. We did a lot of the oral history interviews with scientists, with addiction researchers, many of whom started their careers there in Lexington as residents, as they had these sort of 2-year wonders where they would do their service to the country, their national service, through the public health service, which always ran the clinical side of that institution. So that turned out to be an amazing institution that almost vanished from American history because a lot of the documentation was destroyed or lost. And during that time, I also interviewed some people who told me that there were some documentary filmmakers who were also working on this project. And so I met them. I did an interview for them about the science. And then we began to collaborate on interpreting the materials that we were turning up because we found a lot of photographs. We found a lot of materials that were actually decontextualized, very difficult to figure out what was going on at this place, what was actually happening at the narcotic farm. They were not growing narcotics, that much we know. But they were, working on a farm. The farms were sited where they were so that they would be agricultural land. And there was a whole program around the vocational training and also the recreational training of narcotics addicts who were at the farm. And one of the interesting continuities with what I told you about my earlier life was the narcotic farm was set up for about 1,500 residents at any given time. And about 300 to 400 of them would be women. And then everybody else would be in this very large prison setting. And the interesting thing about that place was that it was set up like an American small town. So people were getting trained to be auto mechanics. They were getting trained to work in pharmacies. They were getting trained to, do food service. They were also, learning to muck out stalls for cows. They were harvesting hay, right? They were doing all these things. And it really was like an American small town. They also had recreation, and they logged their hours of recreation. So, they had bowling alleys, they had softball fields, they had tennis courts, they had a golf course out front. The idea was everybody should be like a healthy, white, American small town, middle class, kind of working class, but kind of middle class person. And that normalcy, right? That was what normalcy was. And that was the very normalcy that I remember, just feeling like I couldn't handle as I was growing up. And so it was kind of ironic, to see that unfold. But it was a really fascinating, and I loved those years of my life because I was really, it felt like, okay, now I'm a real historian. Now I'm not just working with public discourse. I'm really looking at what actually happened here and trying to make sense of the ways of life that were possible within that context. The doctors, the researchers lived on the grounds of the narcotic farm in this sort of plantation-like extension in the back of the institution. It had actually been a farm for thoroughbred horses. And so, it was interesting, like the social history, the cultural history of this place was really very interesting.
And wasn't it the layout, the fundamental idea was essentially that drug addicts were abnormal and that they had to be, right? And so this is the fact
they had to be taught.
They had to be taught to be normal, right? So this went against the idea that it was like it was an argument used against a sort of early disease model from the early 20th century, which is, the argument was, well, if it's a disease, then you have to treat people like patients. And people were saying, well, no, it's not that it's that these are abnormal individuals, right? And they have to be turned into normal individuals, basically, right? And so that's how this whole design got created.
Yes. Yeah. So that was a fascinating project, and I never realized how little it was documented.
Oh, so I did want to ask about that. You said that a lot of the documents were destroyed, or did something happen, or were they just careless about? Because usually in these federal places, there's a, kind of strict.
Yeah, so there was a moment of scandal in the 1970s. The Church Committee, the Kennedy hearings on human subjects following Tuskegee, because by the time the news of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male came, when that hit the press in the summer of 1972, the narcotic farm, Lexington, was the only federal prison where research was still being done on and with federal prisoners. Now, interestingly, there had been liberalization of drug laws in the 1960s, and so the narcotic farm was no longer a prison. It was a large kind of community health kind of treatment center. But the researchers only ever involved people who were, they could not involve subjects, human subjects, who were less than 6 months from their release date. And so in the 1960s, when drug law changed, they had to start recruiting and importing human subjects from Atlanta Penitentiary, from the other federal penitentiaries, were brought specifically to Lexington to the research ward. So they really were running a mini prison, which was not their intention, but it was the way that they obtained people who had substantial expertise on drug addiction.
Okay, so you're doing this research. Your book comes out in 2007, did you say?
Yeah, so the book Discovering Addiction, which it actually has a couple of chapters about the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, the monkey lab. They had a colony of morphine-dependent monkeys. And so there are a couple chapters of that aspect of the attempt to find a non-addicting analgesic, which is a long-running project from the 1920s, you could argue, into the present, that was anchored, the clinical aspects of that program were anchored at the narcotic farm. And so it has a couple chapters about Michigan, a couple chapters, well, really the heart of the book is about the human subjects research at the narcotic farm in Lexington. And then the end of the book is about the succession of sciences and really scientific paradigms, thought styles, through which we study addiction over time. So behavioral pharmacology and neuroscience. And so to put that story together required me to stop being a historian and start being an ethnographer and an anthropologist and actually interview people and study very presentist science. And so it was truly a science studies book. It because it went from being a very historically based book to being a history of the present, which is what I usually say I am. When people ask me, I say, yes, I'm a historian of the present, and I study drugs and drug policy.
When did you, so that's a great segue, because I wanted to ask you about that. So this is right in the midst of the, exploding opioid epidemic. I have kind of a parallel case when I started studying drugs in Mexico in 2001. At the time, people thought it was kind of a weird topic, not very important, which just seemed bizarre to me that they didn't see it was very important. But then within a few years, violence started to explode in Mexico related to drugs. In 2004 is about when it really starts to take off. And then 2006, you get this declaration of war in Mexico. So suddenly, right in the middle of completing my first book, suddenly the topic seems obvious, and where before it seemed weird. Did you have kind of a moment like that too?
Oh, very much so. In fact, people, particularly in science and technology studies, even said to me, well, you're going to have to get out of this, kind of little area because it's really a minor problem. This is, 2000 and on. And I didn't think it was a minor problem, but I don't think anybody knew that yet.
Yeah.
So part of what's really interesting was in 2003, when I started interviewing scientists, a lot of them were working on post-marketing surveillance of OxyContin, and they were also really working on buprenorphine and on the 30-year saga to get buprenorphine to market as an addiction therapeutic drug, because it was an analgesic.
Detector. It was a detector too, right? Before.
Well, and also naloxone. And so what really happened was, I think in 2012, Ann Lovell and I published a history of buprenorphine in the New York Annals. The New York Academy of Science Annals Journal did a special issue on buprenorphine. And so we tried really hard to put together all of that history. And a person read it who was interested in naloxone because there was a formulation called Suboxone that added naloxone. There was this dream, right, of making a tamper-proof analgesic. That is, of course, one of the technocratic sort of ways you could see OxyContin and Suboxone. So I started listening to harm reduction a long time before that, because I was in Santa Cruz and there was harm reduction in Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
And also the HIV/AIDS movement, which we all went up to San Francisco to take part in ACT UP style protests during the HIV/AIDS movement when I was in graduate school. So I knew about these social movements. I knew that I should be interested in them. But to tell you the truth, when I moved to New York, I sat in on a lot of the state regulator, OASIS, had meetings about buprenorphine and about infusing evidence-based practice into treatment within the state of New York. I was fascinated to move to New York because I knew that it had its own story about the opioids in particular. But when that whole time, right, this is 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, that whole time that I was doing that, nobody talked about overdose. No one was talking yet in the state regulatory capacity. The only people who were talking about overdose were people in the harm reduction movement. Yeah. And so I began to listen to them And after publishing that co-authored piece on the history of buprenorphine, one of them called me up and let me do an interview with her, Maya Jo Simpkins, and said, you should be paying attention to naloxone and what we're doing with it. And she was right. I then began to really tune in. Naloxone is such an interesting, because there is a long history of experimentation with naloxone and its predecessor, nalorphine.
Yeah.
And my scientists, the very scientific lab that I was studying, did a lot of experimentation with naloxone and used it to successfully predict that there are multiple kinds of opiate receptors in the brain. That was the upshot of that kind of experimentation. So the narcotic antagonists turned out to be a really fruitful sort of history of science project.
Yeah, which you recently published a book on.
Yeah, in 2020, a week before the pandemic shut down. That was a bit traumatic.
Yeah,
but it's also, I mean, it's quite a story what harm reduction as a social movement have had to do in order to get overdose made into a historical object, something that you could do something with politically. They had to remake opioid overdose, as a political object in order to get it addressed. And it was really their doing, right, to get even CDC involved in, we had miserable data on opioid overdose, miserable tracking of it in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s. It is only very recently that we can look back and really see that the overdose death rate has been ticking up since 1979, inexorably, at a rate of 9% a year. And
is that true?
That predicts our curve. Now, it's interesting because what counts as overdose, what drugs are involved, changes.
Sure.
Changes substantially.
Yeah.
But all during that era, I look at it and I think we really didn't see it until it was too late. Mm-hmm. We thought we had all these early warning systems and DAWN and emergency room and adverse drug reports. We thought we knew what we were doing, and we did not. And so in so many ways, the people who really, the heroes of this story are the people who, like Barry Meyer, and the people who were bringing the opioid overdose epidemic to the attention
of the public. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, the opioid thing, I'm trying to start this oral history project on the opioid epidemic, and I had a research assistant working on that for me this summer. She was reading the newspapers from around here. I'm trying to really base it in Southwest Ohio, where I am, and surrounding areas, which is one of the hot spots. And it is really interesting how you start getting news about it in 1999, starts to really explode in 2000 into 2001, and then you get 9/11. And it just disappears from the media completely, right? Yeah. And it's really interesting that one of the side effects of the attacks on 9/11 is that it just completely wiped out interest in this drug question right as this new epidemic was starting to really catch its stride, it seems like,
Yeah, I think that's right. I have many times looked back and thought, how did I not see it as a continuous story? I did not see it until it was too late. And I think that's the story of it, because it was happening in so many different places, and there were responses, right? But not nothing like a coordinated federal national response. And we know that about drug panics. We know that from our sociologists. We know that drug panics are always local, and that they start in local and often disparate, kinds of ways, and they don't really coalesce for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so I think as a historian, all we can really predict, right, is that things will change, and we can do the best we can to kind of document as we go. And so I think now we're much more alert to that role our role as documentarians of this crisis, of this epidemic, however we want to talk about it. I think the crisis and epidemic language is a bad one for what is really a chronic slow disaster. And so I've thought I constantly ask myself how to convey that we need systemic infrastructural harm reduction in a way that makes it possible to actually change what looks to me like an ongoing death curve. We have never seen a decrease, except for a very brief time when there was a supply interruption. And the switchover from heroin and OxyContin to fentanyl has been pretty interesting to me also as a historian, because in 1975, you had somebody like Sasha Shulgin predicting that this would happen with fentanyl. And yet it doesn't happen for many decades. And then we're in the midst of it, even though there's a blip in 2005 to 2007, where there are several things that are understood to be, in retrospect, fentanyl overdose outbreaks, but then it doesn't really creep into the North American heroin supply until 2012 or so. And then we begin to see a long, slow conversion of people seeking not heroin and not pharmaceutical opioids, but fentanyl, right, as primary drivers.
Right. So this slow rolling, slow developing disaster, as you put it, you're dating that now to 1979. That's when it really begins. The curve starts to, what'd you say, 8% a year? The overdose deaths start growing?
Yeah. So it's about 9% a year. The data is Jalal and Burke. And part of the difficulty, because science studies in part questions our trust in numbers, questions the categories and the ways in which we produce our claims about numbers. And that is particularly important when it comes to overdose deaths and opioid overdose deaths, because it's actually never almost purely the opioid.
Right.
It's usually co-presence, polydrug overdose deaths, right? So benzodiazepines, other central nervous system depressants.
Alcohol.
Right? Alcohol, right? And so when we talk about opioid overdose and we fail to include everything else, we do the disservice of, in a sense, perpetuating the lack of knowledge of what we're actually talking about. Right. And so I have, in writing OD, Naloxone and the Politics of Overdose, and since then, I've really come to grapple with the ways in which how we talk about what is the problem conditions our responses. And we know that, when it comes to drug policy, right, we know that the way that we frame what's the problem here actually also frames what are our perceived solutions. And this reflex that we constantly go back to, there are only two solutions here, treat everybody or lock everybody up. And we have got to find harm reduction offered something off that spectrum. Yeah. And harm reduction, therefore, seems to me like a key point of intervention where you can try something different.
Yeah. Well, I think that I suspect that part of our lack of preparedness for the OxyContin phenomenon, if we don't want to call it opioid epidemic, we call it the OxyContin phenomenon that at least is at the center of all this, was that the lessons of the 80s were too influential. The drugs were about illicit traffickers and race and so forth, which drove a lot of the early scholarship too. But if you go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, the main people who were the targets of the policy reformers back then, who now we would call prohibitionists, but the main targets were the illicit suppliers, the doctors, and the pharmaceutical firms or the British Empire or what have you. And I think if those lessons had still been near the front of our memory, we might have seen this thing coming with the pharmaceutical firms, right? With Purdue Pharma and so forth. But we didn't really, because again, we had this recency bias. We're kind of blinded by the more recent phenomena, where the biggest problem was, of course, this super racist 1980s war on drugs. And in the meantime, we've got this other thing just brewing underneath. So wait, a quick question about since 1979. So do you think that this is about a kind of, speaking of context, kind of deaths of despair situations? I mean, they talk about that. What are their names? Dean and...
Ann Case and Angus
Casey,
Deaton.
They talk about how, the first version of this was among African Americans in the United States in the 70s going to the 80s, that you have these, and they connect it quite explicitly to the crack epidemic, though they don't talk much about it. Do you think that's what's been going on really, and is kind of at the center of all this?
Well, this is a very difficult question for me, Isaac, because I actually don't think that Case and Deaton know very much about opioids and the history of the opioid epidemic. And also because I come from one of these kinds of places, the deaths of despair framework doesn't sit easily with me. And I have to really ask myself, I think, why? So to back up and say a little bit about the racialization of the war on drugs, and in particular, opioid overdose, there were previous concerns about heroin overdose. They were almost always about communities of color, people from communities of color and young people in New York City. And there were moments of concern also about methadone overdose because the New York City Medical Examiner's Office was very concerned about methadone maintenance, et cetera. And so we have had many moments when we did attend somewhat to opioid overdose, but we also didn't have at all very good data surveillance mechanisms. And so I worry about all of the uncounted, unidentified opioid overdose deaths over the years. People used to die in their sleep, right? And I feel that, many opioid overdose deaths occur when people are using as prescribed. It's just, this is a very technical area around dosage, around route of administration, and around set and setting. Ed Brecker noticed that people who were heroin users tolerant to the drug died of overdose only when they were in unfamiliar settings. That's pretty interesting when you think about it in terms of the social and cultural history of overdose. And so I try to talk a bit about that in the book. So as to deaths of despair, it's a very problematic framework in my view. And part of that is also as we look at fentanyl. So African-American overdose deaths were actually baseline pretty low until fentanyl. And Case and Deaton do notice that that African-American overdose deaths rise precipitously after 2012, 2013, when fentanyl is, more present and is beginning to displace heroin. I do not think that we have adequately grasped and dealt with as historians the miserable data surveillance problems. I think that's going to take a little bit more digging and a little bit more than we're probably able to do right now in the present.
So you're referring to the way the deaths are registered? So they'll say opioid, but there might have been multiple things going on, and they're not
right.
Really that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And basically our surveillance systems are pretty new.
Yeah.
And that is a problem. So people can kind of make up stories about what's going on if they have a little bit of data from one particular place, but you can't really knit it all together, or I haven't been able to, in order to tell a full national story. I think you're doing the smart thing, which is let's look at Cincinnati, let's look at Southern Ohio, let's look at particular places and tell those stories. I also agree with you that our forgetting our constant amnesia about the ineffective nature of drug policy is problematic. And in particular, that larger story about the industrialization of the chemical industry and of, before that, the pharmaceutical industry. The other book I'm reading right now is Smoke and Ashes, which is Amitav Ghosh's writer's journey through opium's hidden histories. It's not out in the U.S. yet. Have a wonderful graduate student from India who gifted me his copy. And it's a tremendous retelling of the story of the Opium Wars. I don't know if you read the trilogy that Amitav Ghosh wrote, which is a historical fiction narrative that I learned a lot from. And then when I saw that he was also writing about that and writing about the archival work that he did, he draws parallels with the current opioid overdose epidemic, along with his knowledge of the opium wars.
Yeah.
And that's where I would turn rather than to Case and Deaton.
Yeah.
And it's partly because the narrative that we have to really grapple with is that the British East India Company, i.e. British colonialism, and the refinement, I mean, to this day, it's an interesting problem. The places where there was refinement and distribution of opium, like Scotland, like Edinburgh, like Philadelphia, like Brooklyn, are still places where, people have been sort of dealing with overdose for a very long time and not thinking of it as such. And so I'm pretty interested in, rethinking what we know about the industrial base of this current situation.
What do you mean not thinking of it as such? What are they thinking of it as?
Oh, so for a very long time, people who worked in labor, people who worked in this industry were overdosing and dying or becoming, tolerant, etc. And so there's a big hidden history, right, of the ways in which these industries, also the ways in which people who profited from the opium trade, which was essential, absolutely essential, not only to British colonialism, but also to the early U.S. American, railroad magnates and people who had department stores. Yeah, exactly. And that they, of course, are not thought of as traffickers. And so that, as well as the medical story, because 19th century morphine use and was iatrogenic, right? It was largely caused by, as you said earlier, physicians and other healthcare professionals who had access to these kinds of drugs. And so I think it's a really interesting story that's all caught up in the technical problems of dosage and tolerance and what counts as an overdose death when and for whom, and the various ways in which stigma prevented for many years. Physicians did not put down opioid overdose as a cause of death. And parents, many people did not even put it in obituaries. That is a very recent phenomenon. We don't really see obituaries before 2015 that list that as a cause of death and that try to, where you have a parents movement now that tries to get involved with harm reduction, distribution of naloxone, and tries to make sure that no one else dies as their child died. And so I think it's a really interesting moment when a lot of the kinds of stories that I've tried to tell over my time as a historian have coalesced.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that, but it will be something.
Yeah.
In OD, I had to make sense of that because that was fairly common in the 19th and throughout the 20th century. Opioid overdose deaths were often designated natural causes, this dying in their sleep kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's what makes it so problematic to make claims about when exactly, where exactly this started. What I can say is that we now have an intensive pattern that is very different from, what we began to see in 1979. And I think that the pharmaceutical industry implication in that is really responsible for the fueling of the continuation of that opioid overdose death curve. I don't think that curve excuses the pharmaceutical industry by any means.
Right.
This is, long been an industrial arena. And it's also true that people need access to these kinds of drugs. And so movements to try to ensure that people who are in need of opioids get them are also important to kind of keep present in our discourse. Palliative care and other, there's an awful lot of occupational injury.
Sure.
And so some of the origins, right, of why people would find OxyContin a palliative drug, I think it's important to keep those voices present as well. It's not all, we cannot revert to prohibition.
Right. No.
What we have to do is figure out how to live with highly toxic substances, which we do in other domains, right? We do not well in the environmental domain as well. So we need to be talking with more complexity about how to live with these kinds of toxic chemicals and to live better.
Sure. And that's what makes it such a fascinating historical story and really requires high-level historical thinking to wrap your head around the whole thing, because the fact is that there was a movement to get people appropriate treatment for pain that was necessary and important, but that was hijacked in many ways by the pharmaceutical industry. The fact that they hijacked it doesn't mean that there wasn't a legitimate need for people with pain to get proper care and some of them to have access to opioids. It just means that the pharmaceutical industry jumped all over that opportunity to be able to sell as many of these drugs as they possibly could, right? And so we somehow have to be able to find the middle ground there, right? As you're saying.
Yeah. In some ways, it's a kind of a story of restraint, right? If there had been restraints, if there had been guardrails, if there had been a variety of mechanisms that we've developed for other lethal things, then the story would be different. But the fact is, we're not that great at governing lethal things either.
No,
so we need to invest in capacity to do that better.
Yeah. The other just interesting thing is I still think we don't learn the lessons. So right now everybody knows that Purdue Pharma, I'll give the super simple version, Purdue Pharma caused the opioid epidemic, right? This is like everybody has some idea of that. At the same time, we've got this, get back to David Courtwright, his concept of limbic capitalism, on that we have this marijuana legalization going on, legalization of gambling everywhere, with essentially no guardrails, right, for people. I mean, and so tomorrow in Ohio, we vote on marijuana legalization, and we'll see what happens. But I don't see anybody talking about, except for the prohibitionists, that we have to be careful about how this stuff gets advertised to people. In Michigan, where I'm from, you go there and every other billboard is either a billboard for marijuana or for craft beer or for gambling, basically. Yeah. Just... and if, for people who have for people who have a problem with these substances, that's really harmful, right? That there's just unlimited advertising of this stuff. They can't get away from it. And we know this about gamblers in Las Vegas. You just can't get away from it anywhere. So it's really, really hard to stop your problem use, right? And so, and almost nobody's talking about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that I've tried to write history of is treatment and the various ways in which we have tried to treat people who have problematic relationships with a variety of substances and behaviors. We'll just put it that way. So what would harm reduction look like in that kind of a world? I think that's going to become very important because I think that there will be response, right, to this kind of opening up of these kinds of psychoactives. And they are all, I'm actually writing at the moment a little piece on whether extreme sports can be viewed as addictive. And so it's interesting because there are a range of behaviors and the effects on people's lives are quite similar.
Yeah.
And so what do we make of that? And how do we think about what kind of a world do we want to live in?
Mm-hmm.
I think that ultimately has to be that kind of question. I myself have been shocked returning to Seattle or, reading about, what has happened in Mendocino County.
Yeah.
The places that I lived in and observed in the 80s and what has happened to them as a result of legalization.
Yeah.
And which, has been presented as a social good. And so it's because it would somehow reduce the negative effects, the consequences of criminalization.
Yeah.
But actually, it's produced a new and different kind of activities and new patterns, and we will have to be documenting those and making sense of them for years to come.
Absolutely. Well,
so it's a lifelong work.
It sure is. Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Though I guess fortunately in another way. Well, Nancy, I don't want to keep you forever. This has been really terrific. Anything else you want to mention or?
No, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground.
Yeah.
Yes, we've gotten out of Pennsylvania and out to the West Coast and back again.
Yeah.
We've and a lot of temporal ground as well.
Yeah.
So it's really been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And
totally.
I look forward to seeing what you're going to do with it.
Oh, I know. Me too. All right. Cool. Well, thanks so much. All right. Another great conversation. Thanks to Nancy Campbell for coming on. I really appreciate it. This was actually the first one we ever did remotely. I'd always rather do conversations in person if possible, but nowadays, sometimes you just got to do them remote. And we did this one remote, and I think it turned out pretty good anyway. Make sure to check out Nancy's most recent book, OD, Naloxone, and the Politics of Overdose, which came out in 2020. Lots of horrible things happened in 2020, but Nancy's book came out, and that was a good thing. I always feel bad for people whose books came out in 2020. Not a lot of opportunities for doing press and that sort of thing. But there you go. OD, Naloxone, and the Politics of Overdose. As always, please like, subscribe, all that stuff. Check out the newsletter. And until next time, bye-bye.